Hi everyone. Welcome to the AI Readiness Gap when adoption comes before governance. I hope you enjoyed your last session. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A tab. You probably know this; it's old hat to you already. But if you have any questions that you'd like to see answered, go ahead and put them in and upvote it. So I'll get started right now with the AI Readiness Gap.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Dimitri Vlachos, and I have the pleasure of being the CMO of Spacelift. And I'm excited today to be giving you a IaCConf exclusive preview of some of the findings from our upcoming 2026 infrastructure automation report, which we'll be releasing next month. But it's some pretty interesting data, I think very appropriate for IaCConf that we wanted to share. So I thought I'd start by setting the context of what led us to want to research a particular topic in the 2026 report. And when you look at 2025, it was a very interesting year when it comes to AI adoption and some growing differences between developers and infrastructure teams. And it's really based on what really got us down this path is interesting data from two significant reports about the market. One is the DORA report specifically about AI enhanced development and the rate at which AI is being adopted by developers and some of the impact of that. Notably, 90% of developers have adopted AI to help them in their day-to-day jobs. In fact, they're using it 25% of the time. That's a pretty massive adoption rate in just a few years. And the overwhelming use case they're using it for at 71% is to write new code. And additionally, it's not on this slide, but 80% of developers report a significant increase in productivity from using AI to produce code. So that's kind of one side of 2025. If you look at the infrastructure side, and this is from our report from last year, our 2025 report, 50% of infrastructure teams report taking a week or more to make infrastructure changes. 43% report needing to rerun deployments up to 4 times, and 50% are still struggling to scale their infrastructure as code automation. So it's a very different picture in some ways. And by the way, I really view IaC and kind of IaC automation as really a response to the last wave of developer change in behavior and change in operating model, namely CI/CD. So you see an infrastructure team that is, still struggling in many ways to keep pace with what developers were doing in the past, and now there's a whole nother layer of acceleration that developers are going through, and infrastructure teams, need to kind of react. And that's really what we wanted to explore in this year's report. So we surveyed 406 both practitioners and leaders across a variety of industries, infrastructure team leaders and practitioners across a variety of industries and company sizes. And we looked at two main things. One is their infrastructure automation. We wanted to keep a baseline of key questions so we can look year over year in terms of changes. But we also put a focus or a section really in there of questions about AI's impact on infrastructure teams, both what they're feeling, the impacts they're feeling from AI accelerated development, but also how are infrastructure teams themselves adopting and using AI. So that's really kind of the focus. And so let's go through some of the interesting findings. So right off the bat, if you look at what we kind of call the AI infrastructure gap, and this is trying to put some actual data behind what it's a sentiment out there of infrastructure teams. And you can see that, just a little over 2/3 say that development is ahead of infrastructure in terms of AI adoption. So that might be the sense you would naturally feel just given the nature of what we see in the market, but it's really interesting to put an actual stat behind it. And then on the same side, not only do they feel behind, but they also are feeling a lot more pressure. So 86% report that they're feeling increased demands on their teams because of AI accelerated development. And we wanted to go a little deeper on, well, what is the pressure they're feeling? In what areas? And so you can see here that, the top one is faster deployment expectations, increased volume of changes, complex, the complexity of provisioning needs. So some of these might not be shocking, but I think it's really interesting to look at governance and security, which you'll see that governance is a major part we're going to talk about in terms of the findings. But it's 39% say governance and security concerns are a big issue in terms of the pressure they're feeling. So this gives some insight into that constant, we're feeling a lot more pressure to go faster, and we're feeling the pressure of how do we get control over all this acceleration due to AI development. And yet, when falling behind, what's really interesting is 81% of infrastructure teams saying it's extremely important that they keep pace with AI-driven development. But when you look at what's actually happening, it's interesting to compare these numbers to what we're seeing on the development side, right? So 32% of infrastructure teams have AI deeply embedded in multiple stages of their workflows, right? Only 39% are using AI commonly, but there's no standardization. 21 are still using it to pilot or experiment, so not really kind of broad adoption. And 7% are still only in the early exploration phase. So it's when you step back and think about it, infrastructure teams and platform teams and DevOps teams, right? They're the ones responsible. You guys are the ones responsible for a lot of the putting rigor behind what's being deployed, availability, reliability. And so it's not shocking that there's a little less adoption of AI right away, but the pressure is definitely being felt, and the shift to needing to catch up and have governance is real. And kind of that's the next part we want to talk about is governance, because at the end of the day, it's platform teams and DevOps teams that are left kind of holding the bag when it really comes to the infrastructure that's out there and what happens if there are issues. So when we now shift to look at the governance side of the house with infrastructure, you can see that there's this paradox. 86% of these teams feel or say that they're actually confident about governing AI assisted infrastructure, but yet only 30% have a formal AI governance policy. And we can feel the impact, the lack and failure of governance, you can actually see come right through in this survey. 79% face a lot of resistance when they're trying to implement an AI governance policy for their infrastructure team. So we know it's critical. We know it's the speed at which AI is allowing code to be developed, application code to be developed is dramatically accelerating, and control is even more important. And yet infrastructure teams are finding resistance when they're trying to put controls in place. So that's kind of very interesting to me on its own. And then you can see, well, what happens when there's a lack of governance, or there's non-standards, or people can kind of do what they want. 78% are deploying AI generate HCL code without proper review. And this one I found quite interesting, because we know that's happening on the development side. But when we really dug in the survey of comparing the rate at which AI is being used to generate and ship code, whether it's developer code or HCL, IaC HCL code, they're nearly identical. So the idea that we need to get stuff out there faster, and we're willing to give up governance to get there, is mainstream here, both on the developer side and infrastructure code side. So this to me is a very interesting takeaway, that how do we rein in that control while not giving up the speed that's clearly being demanded is a real challenge for companies. And when you look at the impact, the effects of this governance gap, 93% of our respondents are reporting incidents that are happening because of AI created infrastructure. So when you break down where are those incidents coming from, where's the risk that's being introduced by AI generated HCL, where is that actually showing up? Well, security vulnerabilities, very similar to application code. Maintaining governance and compliance. A lot of companies have very strict rules, not just internal rules, but compliance rules. And how do you actually keep pace at the speed at which things are being deployed? How do you make sure you're meeting those compliance regulations? So those are just some of them, but I think you can see here that it's this interesting combination of pressure to go fast. There's a lot of pressure to keep compliance and regulation, and yet that's not happening. And so what happens on the flip side? So you have an incident, things get deployed very quickly without control, especially when it's AI generated HCL and code. And so you end up with a lot more manual work to actually fill the gap that should have been automated policy and controls, automated governance, things that should be there to throttle and control that AI generated infrastructure is not happening. And so what ends up happening is 37% are having to rework poorly AI generated HCL, right? And the same number, the top three are really interesting because they're kind of clustered in compliance, security, and reworking poorly, written HCL. So I think it's this interesting, you're seeing a lot of similarities in terms of the willingness to trade off speed for control when you get to infrastructure, which has real implications, and you could argue bigger implications than allowing application code to make that trade-off. And in fact, if you look, 90% with such a lack of governance, we're seeing 90% of AI generated HCL is being, produced outside of governed workflows. So most of the AI generated HCL people are doing is being deployed without going through any kind of policy engine, any kind of check, which is pretty scary. And of course, 93% are experiencing AI generated infrastructure incidents. So it's pretty clear a couple of things here. One, the gap existed, this governance gap existed before AI arrived, but AI is really accelerating the consequences. And so as we talk about findings at the end here, so getting automated policies in place as fast as possible for whether it's AI generated or more traditionally generated infrastructure, those pipelines have to have governance in them. It's more critical than ever. Which also brings us to the agentic cliff. So if traditional GitOps and IaC was kind of the reaction to the change in CI/CD as a development standard and operating model, AI, it kind of agent-based or, not agent-based, chat-based, LLM interaction-based creation of code and of HCL infrastructure code was kind of the next phase. Well, agentic is coming very quickly. In fact, 89% plan to adopt agentic AI for infrastructure, and 24% plan to do it within 6 months. So if the next wave is coming very quickly, and it's going to really accelerate even further and make it harder and harder to have, non-automated policy and governance work, because the idea of having a human in the loop for agentic workflows, I think, is even harder than what it is today with AI generated code. So I think this is like the next part that's just the impact of not having a governance automated and in place is just continuing to build upon itself. I think it's a big finding here for sure. And another key thing we were looking at is, well, what are the metrics that you really need to look at if AI is going to start to produce, whether it's via chat, whether it's via general AI, or if it's agentic, what are the measurements you need to have in place now to understand this new operating model? And it's pretty clear people aren't really doing these yet, which you can kind of understand, but you'll see some leaders are actually. But coming out of this research, it's clear that at least these three are ones we view as pretty critical. Your AI error rate. So what percentage of the infrastructure code you're generating with AI, or even agentically or chat-based, if you will. What is the error rate of that infrastructure as it goes through and gets used? That's an important one. Holistically, the percentage of policy-governed workflows. So the idea that you could have ungoverned pipelines deploying into your production, what is that mix and what percentage is being out there without a lot of checks? I think that's really important moving forward. And how can you back up that feeling confidence about governing AI without knowing the actual policy coverage you have for workflows that are deploying your infrastructure? And then certainly the percentage of AI generated infrastructure that's happening within your company, because it might be a little easier to do when you're generating that, when your platform teams and DevOps teams are using LLMs interactively, via chat to build that. It's another thing when you start to have agentic workflows deploying. How are you going to keep track of what percentage is AI generated and what isn't? So these are just examples of three metrics that have emerged as pretty important to keep track of as you're starting to really adapt and adopt AI within your infrastructure program. So the good news is there is a recipe to get it right. And we certainly dig into in the report and in the findings some of the things that we establish a framework of leaders and laggards in the report, and you can definitely see some really interesting key findings, and I summarized the high level ones here. Automation level, right? 92% of leaders report being fully or almost or mostly automated in terms of their deployment and all their pipelines for deployment versus 14% of laggards. A formal governance policy, we talked about a little earlier in terms of some of the struggles people have in establishing an AI governance policy, or the dichotomy between people think they can actually govern versus how many have a policy. But you can see leaders have a formal AI governance policy. 71% of them do. 25% of leaders have adopted a platform engineering approach. And I think this is a theme that keeps coming up across the industry. Platform engineering adoption is critical to success in, I think, current infrastructure operations, and certainly more and more in the future. 25% of leaders have adopted a platform engineering team and approach, 2% of laggards. So if anything, I think the reason for that is a lot of what we're talking about, of balancing speed and control, is at the heart of what a platform team and platform engineering team does with automation. And that's a key thing for really getting the shift to, or being able to manage infrastructure at AI speed and in the AI age this is a critical one. And then you can see some of the real impact of what it means to be a leader versus a laggard. So I don't think anyone would expect perfectness when you're using AI to deploy or create infrastructure and deploy it. But leaders, 17% of leaders report zero AI caused incidents versus 3%. So that's a meaningful difference as you look at this. So in terms of that recipe to get things right, what are 5 things we believe you should do to really get on that path? And one is make IaC coverage your first priority. So what isn't automated cannot be governed, right? So I think the first stage is, and leaders, by the way, 91% of leaders report 91% coverage of automation. That's a big number, and I think it's a telling number. So step one, get a lot of your as much of your infrastructure covered by IaC and by automation as you can. Step two, build the governance on top of that automation before you need it, right? 71% of a formal policy. I think a lot of the leaders were doing very well adapting to the CI/CD wave that has been around for a long time, but they were well prepared because of that, and they built the infrastructure and the automation, so they were very well set up for this next wave of AI. And I think those first 2 steps are absolutely critical. Number 3, as you can see in this report, one of the stats we talked about, right? 90% of AI generated HCL is ungoverned. So it is kind of the Wild West in terms of the amount of HCL being produced by AI that is ungoverned. I think is a real risk to this, availability, performance, all the different key characteristics of running really smooth production. So, does that mean you might not have it fully governed, but you have it governed in an area that goes off into a protected area, a kind of ephemeral area, and you have a formal pipeline that does some checking, but allows a little less stringency there, but then moves it up when it goes to production. There's many different ways to interpret or implement this, but you got to make it easy enough so that people don't feel the burden to that they'd rather produce HCL outside your workflow versus through a workflow. And then number 4, AI metrics into your infrastructure operations. We think that's critical to be able to really understand how AI is actually being used, so then you can actually improve and understand what's going wrong and what's going right. And then 5, plan for agentic governance now, because that's coming fast and furious. It's the next wave. The time between, now and the next wave you can see is, very short for some. Sure, they might be over optimistic, but it is coming. And the ability to govern and to embed that governance and control into agentic workflows is going to be absolutely critical. So those are just 5 things we believe are critical in terms of preparing. Preparing sounds like it's not here yet. It's certainly here in various waves and stages for different companies, but being ready or catching up to what's going on with AI enhanced development is critical. And these are 5 things we think you can do to get there now. So that hopefully gives you a good picture of some of the research that's come out of our 2026 report. And as I mentioned, it will be available and we'll be shipping it next month. And we'll certainly share it with the whole IaCConf attendance list. And we'll go through any questions now that people might have. Thank you.
There we go. Thank you so much, Dimitri, for that presentation. That was fantastic.
Thank you.
There's so much insight. There's so much detailed insight there. I need to go back and rewatch it. We have a bunch of questions from the audience. Let's start here with Anton. All of these numbers are pretty useless as is. Let's compare it to something we knew at least for a few years. What known numbers can we compare it with now in 2026?
So yeah, that's a good question in terms of numbers we can compare it to that we know. We do get into that. I mean, one part of the part we're doing right now is looking at 2025 versus 2026 in terms of baseline numbers. So, but I don't have those handily right now of like real comparisons to baseline, if you will. I do think it's interesting to look at the baseline of what the DORA metrics about developers showed, right? So it's pretty interesting to look at a 90% adoption in terms of those using AI as developers, the time that they're spending with it, and the use case they're looking for. So those are some interesting comparisons, just the amount of adoption. And then I think what was interesting is the fact that there's such a similar rate of developers writing code before, without it going through a process of check versus HCL code being produced by AI. The fact that those are so similar in terms of the kind of the ability or the people allowing code to be written and then into production, that they're so similar, I found pretty interesting as a comparison metric.
Absolutely. And I think it's just hard to compare, right? This is 2026. Agentic frameworks are everywhere. That just didn't exist a year or two ago. This is a whole new world. It's interesting to study.
Yes.
Totally. This next question is from me. This is something I have established, and I have no idea if it's a bad idea. Hopefully you can tell us. Do you feel having AI check the code that a different AI has written, like having Claude Code write code and then Copilot review it, has any value here?
I would say so. Interesting subject to this. I was actually in in Penn Station in New York, and there's a whole big advertising campaign by I forget the name, but an AI testing company saying this exact thing. Hey, the biggest weakness of your AI code, you don't test it, you need AI to test it. And so that is, I think, something that, will continue to come up. But I do think the LLMs are pretty, depending on what context you give it and what role you want it to play, it can take a very different opinion. Like, oh, I want you to write code for me. And, you're not really asking it about security concerns. The context is not there for it to really focus on security or hygiene of the code, is very different than if you really set a lot of context around a LLM to actually think of security, think of hygiene. That's a big difference in how the LLMs approach. So I do think there's some validity to having an LLM good at writing code and having an LLM that's good at reviewing code. But it is kind of an interesting paradox in general. But hey, that's what we do in human terms, right? We've got development teams and we have QA teams. So you can ask the same question of humans, and it's about specialization. So I do think there is validity to it for sure.
Totally. Here's some fire. Would you like some fire to help put it out? But it does work a little bit better than that.
Yes.
Daniel has a great question here. What is your process for developing an initial governance policy, and how do you implement it?
Yes, I think in terms of, there's a couple of key ones, right? I think you step back and look at certainly who should have access, what should they, there's controlling who has access, there's controlling what can be deployed, there's setting up clear rules about different environments. Like you might be more lenient in terms of your non-production environment, of course, so the experimental areas. But how do you write policies that allow those frameworks to be implemented, I think is really key. But those are some of the pieces we really look at is, then you want, what kind of policies do you want when someone's planning, in the plan stage versus deploy stage. So there's many different areas of a lot of stages of your pipeline. What checks do you want in those? Who has access and what they can do? Those are just some of the frameworks. But I think it's also got to be a framework that is not just paper. It needs to be something you can turn in to policies in your pipelines that are actually actionable in automation. I think that's a key framework that needs to be in the mindset when you're writing policies, because I saw one comment about, agentic doesn't mean that humans won't be in the loop. And sure, I can see that from a kind of overall perspective, but I think when we work with a lot of our customers, they're really wanting to put in place automated checks so that a lot of the things that are just commonplace that shouldn't slip through get flagged. And then, yes, there might be a human override to go allow that or to force it back to be fixed. But I think thinking a lot about automation when you're building your policies is really important.
And further, just to build on Daniel's question, you mentioned during your talk that there's a great deal of pushback on platform teams and other teams that are trying to implement these governance policies, but also that 93% of the respondents, I wrote this number down because it was so staggering, had seen AI-caused infrastructure incidents. Why do we not want to solve the problem? Why do teams not want to permit folks to implement guardrails when it's clear AI is causing problems? And how do we...
I think part of this is everyone wants to move fast. Part of this is, can you make guardrails easy enough that they don't, produce so much headache for people just trying to get basic things done? And I think a lot of times what happens with trade-offs is people are trying to develop code, right? You have one path for all the same type of development you're doing in terms of an infrastructure pipeline. That's where we see a lot of times people get friction, because there's a very different path for if you're going through the rigor of full production deployment versus, hey, we're experimenting, we're trying to get very quickly. And if you look at AI-driven, workloads or just the nature of AI-driven coding, it's very iterative. It's a lot more iterative than human-based. And so the idea of being able to deploy into an area, maybe your policies are a little lighter to begin with, but you're allowing this quick iteration. And then when you're ready to actually push it into more production or more stringent pipelines, that's when you increase your rigor of your policies. But you have to make sure that you have the right type of policies enforced for the type of developments going on, so that people will use those pipelines and don't just start deploying on their own. I think that's some of the pieces that the resistance comes from. I don't think it's a resistance of not wanting policies in place. It's a resistance of they're too hard to use. I'm going to work around it.
Absolutely. If the walls are too high, then your developers are going to go around them instead of working with them.
Yes.
Totally. Question here from Emmanuel. What are the current tools used for automating governance policies effectively? I think there's a couple of earlier talks in the day that cover this, but if you want to take a whack at it too.
Yeah, I think it's policy as code. It's its ability to put those in the right stages of your pipeline. So it's not just having them be not just having it at the planning stage, at the deploy stage. Different stages of your IaC pipelines is key. I also think that it's interesting going, around this area of governance. 41% of the developers report frustrations, when they try to increase governance. So there's actually data in here about the frustration people do feel about these controls, and 36% of leaders report skepticism in kind of the ROI of controls. So I think there's both the frustration of implementing. There's also, how do you justify? I mean, remember, the pressure to move faster is really about keeping pace in the industry and competitiveness and getting software out there. So I think, there's multiple sides to this challenge of getting governance in place.
Absolutely. And I feel like the rules should be for everyone else, but not for me. And I think everyone feels I'm the main character just like everybody else is.
I think that's true in any part of a company, right? It's not limited to development and infrastructure teams, but I think it's also interesting that there's some applications that you're running are so critical, you got to be really stringent. Some are more, I think, as users of applications and of software, we're getting more and more accustomed. I wouldn't say to buggy software, but always having new features out that you're like, oh, that's kind of okay. It's not working like I want. It'll get updated in the next sprint. But for certain applications, that's not acceptable at all. And so that needs to be understood as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think our baseline platform uptimes, our expectations are just lower. And maybe we want more features and we're okay to trade that off with 99% uptime. I'm looking at you, GitHub.
Yeah. I mean, even cell phones, right? I mean, the phone network, like almost everything feels that way now. Yes. Yeah.
Totally. We have almost 2 minutes, so I think this will probably be our last question. Johannes has a question. Could some of these issues like security, bad HCL, etc., could they be migrated by more back pressure, like more local testing of the AI results via pre-commit and other tools?
Yes. So that I think comes back to the idea of where your policies, the further left, shift left in terms of policies too, like the further integrated your policy checks can be automated and early, I think is critical, because you catching it earlier is a huge piece. And so I think that is another piece of building policies that are appropriate, as close to the upstream as you can be. I think is critical. So yeah, we see a lot of people. It's really interesting when we see customers kind of come to us and start to deploy, and policies and drift detection are usually very high on their list. And then stage one is, let me get my automation and my pipelines really in place. Then let me add governance. And so that second step, sometimes people, can be one that aspirationally you want to do, but it just gets, the nature of the complexity of these pipelines, people can sometimes put that on the back shelf. But yes, the more and more you can push that to the front and early in your cycle is critical.
Absolutely. Sorry if we missed anyone's questions. We just have a limited amount of time. Thank you so much, Dimitri, for speaking here today. That was wonderful information.
Well, thank you, Kyler, and thank you, everybody. And we'll be sending the report out to everybody when it ships next month.
Perfect. All right, we'll end it here. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.